Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be talking about a game that, I'll be honest, really took me by surprise on how much I adored it. And that game is 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Now, I will say that when I started playing this game, I had no intention of making a video on it. But as I was playing it, I just realized how unique of a game this is. While the individual pieces of this game have been done before, I don't feel like I've played a game that has combined all of these different gameplay styles and mechanics while also telling a really complex narrative that left me enthralled the entire way through. Now, just explaining what this game is tough to do in its own right. I mean, at its core, it is a narrative-based experience that is split into 3 different gameplay sections. You do have the Remembrance sections, which is the majority of the game and puts you in a side-scrolling adventure game, playing as one of 13 protagonists within the game. You obviously have your typical interacting of objects in the environment that, in this game, allows you to add keywords to your thought cloud, which you can use to hear the inner thoughts of the character, but also you can use these keywords to change the way you interact with the world and allow you to unlock new conversations and sometimes flashbacks that slowly reveal more about the game's story. And the way that the game's story is told is something that I don't feel like you typically see in games, where the entire story is told non-linearly, where the story jumps around all over the timeline, slowly having revelations through every story thread. Now again, there are 13 characters. I really love the way that this game uses these 13 storylines, where they're all obviously interconnected and all lead up to the final battle that takes place at the end of the game. But the way that this story is told is that when you select a character, they're usually thrown into the same scenario almost every time, but you can interact with things in a different way that leads to a different outcome, and through that you learn a different piece of the puzzle. And the game does provide you with a flowchart to keep track of all the different available situations, which I really loved all this. I really love the way this game tells its story. It allows it to spread out its reveals throughout the game, while also having you wondering what's really going on for the majority of it, all while also allowing you, for the most part, to choose the order in which you play these storylines. The game does also have points where you can't continue until you get to a certain point in another storyline. Again, just playing these storylines off of each other in a way that I felt like was a really interesting way of telling this game's story. Again, the interconnectivity between all these storylines was a massive highlight in my eyes. Now, the way that you keep track of the story here is through the analysis mode of the game, which doesn't involve any real gameplay. This mode itself is split into 2 sections, where one is a timeline of the entire game's events that do get updated as you progress through Remembrance mode, and you see it slowly filling out throughout the game, which makes the story feel really grand in its scale, and again makes it feel like you're piecing together the story as you move along. The other section is really just a glossary of the game's lore, and you do have to unlock entries using mystery points that you can get from the final mode that we will talk about. But really, the analysis mode here is mostly just there just to add context to the story. Now, the final mode in the game is probably the strangest of the 3, as coming into this game, you would probably think, okay, this is a narrative-based game. And again, having those 2 other modes makes sense. But to have a 3rd mode here in the destruction mode, this real-time strategy combat section, is kind of bizarre. I mean, it does add a bit to the story. I mean, it does take place after most of the events of the Remembrance mode, where the characters are now piloting their Sentinels and fighting against the kaiju, who are really just other mechs. But I mean, these sections are fine. I mean, there are 38 of these combat sections in total. Most of them are relatively short, and if you don't really care about this section's gameplay, you can put it on the easiest difficulty, which makes the combat super simple. And when doing that, I never really had any difficulty with the game. And it also made it a lot easier to get the top ranks in each of these waves and complete the optional objectives. So again, getting 100% completion in this game is pretty easy here. Battles themselves also allow you to pick 6 characters to utilize for each battle, and each character has their own Sentinels, to which there are 4 different types, and the game incentivizes you to use different characters throughout the game, having a system where after you use a character twice, they are blocked off for a single wave. And through each consecutive win, you do get bonuses. Now you can reset this cycle, which allows you to override these limitations, though obviously they reset the bonuses as well. Now, as I mentioned before, through this system, you do get mystery points that allow you to progress the analysis system. You also do get meta chips, which allow you to upgrade the mechs, which this game does have a surprisingly robust upgrade system that feels like it would take you forever to complete, which I'll be honest, I didn't really bother with outside of what I needed to get the platinum trophy. Again, the combat system in this game is fine. Being able to destroy an entire horde of kaijus with one attack is really satisfying. But really, I spent most of my time playing this section really just wanting to learn more about the story. Though the section didn't really drag as you would think it would, and really didn't harm my overall opinions of the game. If anything, it actually added more to my opinions of this game as it makes this game stand out. And the entire complexity of all of these systems within this game was a massive surprise to me, as when the game initially starts, it starts off very linearly, where you go back and forth between a remembrance section and an instruction section. And we get introduced to the first 7 protagonists, and I was thinking that this must be the entire game. It must just be a really linear gameplay experience. But then, after the pretty lengthy prologue, and everything unlocks, it really did blow my mind to fully recognize the scale of this game and how you could really do most things in the order that you want to. So those are the 3 gameplay sections within the game, but I haven't really talked about the game's narrative yet, which is a major attraction for this game. Again, this game does tell us this story from the perspective of 13 teenagers, mostly taking place in the year of 1985. But we are led to believe from the beginning that this is a time travel story, where we do have sections that take place in other time periods, each 40 years apart, and we think that these characters are traveling throughout time, and that these events that we are seeing are events that are to come, events that are in the future, and I really love the mystery that gets unraveled here. Now, the story itself doesn't really do anything that new when taken at face value, but the way that the story is told here really makes the story feel fresh. The main plot points for me were kind of what I was expecting. The idea that these are actually parallel worlds, not actual time travel, and that this is a simulation created by the people that we assume to be from the future, only to find out they're actually from the distant past. And all this is really great, though not entirely original. Again, a comparison that comes to my mind is something like Horizon Zero Dawn, that has a very similar premise for its story, though obviously they are taken in completely different directions. But again, this did lead to a lot of great mystery around the circumstances in this world and who are these playable characters and how are they all connected, which we obviously learn throughout the story that there are multiple versions of the same characters, where we obviously have the real life versions from the true past of the game, but we also have past versions of these clones within this simulation from previous loops. Now, surprisingly, I've actually gotten this far into the video without even mentioning a character name. So let's finally talk about the 13 protagonists here and their individual stories. So let's go in the order of how I unlock them. So let's start off with the person who I assume is supposed to be the main protagonist to a degree, and that is the first character we play as, and that is Juro Kurabe, who initially seems like this innocent high school student who loves to watch movies, but we obviously later learn that he is the latest version of Juro Izumi, this serial killer from a previous loop that is a pretty important figure in the events from the past, but also we later learn moving forward that he's pretty integral into the events happening currently as well. Now, a lot of Kurabe's actual storyline revolves around his interactions with Kyuta Shiba, who we later learn is an imaginary figure in his head, really just being the AI of Juro Izumi, who's attempting to take over Kurabe's body. And that was a fun reveal, and the entire mystery over why Kurabe is being known by the others as Juro Izumi is also a major point of interest in the early portions of the game. Next up, we have Iori Fuyusaka, who is a character that seemed to have a similar background to Juro, and we later learn how connected these two are, with Fuyusaka actually being a clone of Chihiro Morimura, who is another major figure within the lore of this game. And even in the present, as it does get pretty bizarre that there are 3 versions of Morimura that are important to the storyline of this game. We obviously have Fuyusaka here. We have the Morimura from Izumi's loop. That is a major catalyst for the story, with her being pretty integral in Izumi's storyline and all of the events that happen in that previous loop. And she does also end up showing up in this loop, with her being the school nurse that is kind of controlling things in the background. But we also have a child version of Chihiro from 1945 that later gets the memories of the real Morimura from the real world, and that in itself is also a really fun revelation. But Fuyusaka's actual gameplay sections are mostly focused around this pretty lame scenario, actually, that has Fuyusaka just hanging out with her friends, and you use keywords at the right times during those conversations to progress the story. I did find a lot of her gameplay actually kind of confusing, but through this we do get a lot of her romance with Sekigahara, which felt like a really generic, innocent girl falling in love with the bad guy sort of story that you kind of see all the time in media. After getting introduced to those two pretty similar characters, we then jump to Takatoshi Hijiyama, who is a radically different character. And for me, I did find him to be one of the least memorable figures here, and probably one of the least important to the overall story. Now, I do think a lot of that has to do with the fact that while Hijiyama does get introduced very early on, you can't actually continue on with his story again for a decent amount of time. I don't believe I actually did so until probably like the back third of my playthrough. Now, a lot of his plot revolves around his relationship with Okino, who is this cross-dressing guy that he falls in love with, who does turn out to be one of the most knowledgeable people about what is actually going on here, with him having a lot of knowledge about the Sentinels and him coming off as this really mysterious figure for most of the story. But again, Hijiyama for me was a pretty meh character. I did find his gameplay sections kind of annoying as well, with it mostly revolving around finding money to buy yakisoba pan because he loves yakisoba pan. And one of the storylines is actually dedicated to showing why he loves yakisoba pan. It's so dumb. Next up, we have Natsuno Minami, who is a track and field student that is obsessed with UFOs and aliens. And her storyline revolves around BJ, this robot that she finds. And most of her early plot feels like a copy of E.T., though it later expands to being one of the most interesting in the game, with this giving us our first look into the future periods within the game, and we get a lot of mystery set up through her storyline, though most of them are concluded within other storylines. Minami herself is a solid enough character within the game, even though I don't feel like she's given as much depth as certain other characters. Again, I feel like her storyline more so progresses other storylines, while she kind of gets regulated to focusing around her relationship with BJ. Next up, we have Megumi Yakushiji, who I think is probably my personal favorite character within the game. I mean, while again, she does follow a lot of the same tropes that you would see from other pieces of media, and the fact that she's in love with Juro. However, with Juro having lost his memories, she does everything she can to get Juro's memories back, which leads to her making a deal with Fluffy, this cat that can only speak to her in a similar way that Shiba talks to Juro. And again, we get the reveal later on that Fluffy is actually the AI of Juro Izumi, using her to inject others that are compatible with the Sentinels with nanomachines, which does end up allowing the endgame events to occur. But throughout this game, we are under the assumption that she is being used for more sinister reasons. And again, finding out what Fluffy's real plan is a great mystery throughout this game, where in reality, Izumi is preparing their bodies to use the Sentinels, as it turns out that he's actually someone that is actively striving to stop the kaijus and is actually helping them out, despite him being looked at as a major antagonist for the majority of the story. After her, we get to Shu Amaguchi, who we see as this really kind-hearted rich kid, but he ends up having similar dreams to that of Juro and Iori, and we do find out that he is this loop's version of Tetsuya Ida, the leader of the SIU, this group manipulating these events in the background. And Ida serves as one of the major antagonists throughout the game, though he's not even necessarily evil. I mean, he most so just acts with his own selfish motivations. But through his storyline, we do learn about his connection to Tomi Kisaragi, who we will get to later, but Amaguchi's story here also has some pretty important side plots in it as well, involving Miyuki Inaba, a pop idol that he talks to through his TV, which we eventually find out is actually the AI of Ida's version of Kisaragi, who becomes a pretty important ally during the final battle of the game. We do also get his relationship with Yuki Takamiya, and we get this pretty great sequence of them trying to leave the city, and we get this first major hint at the reality of the situation within this game, where we find out that the city just abruptly ends with the world that the characters are in being a 30-kilometer recreation of a real city. But now we get to the final character that we play as during the prologue of the game, and that is Ei Sekigahara, who we get introduced to immediately after he had lost his memories in him finding Morimura's dead body, thinking that he had murdered her. And his plot obviously revolves around him trying to remember what had happened. And through that, we get most of his story being told in flashbacks, as his base story here actually is the latest chronologically of the 13 protagonists. Sekigahara is another one that I feel like is just more of a cliched sort of character. Again, this cold assassin-like figure that falls in love with this outgoing, naive girl, that being Iori. But Sekigahara's story here is also pretty important to the overall story through his connections with the SIU and the characters within it like Shinonome and Ida. The next character I unlocked was Kitaro Miura, who we get introduced to in 1945, where he does end up accidentally traveling to 1985, and we get a lot of his relationship with Minami. But the most interesting thing about his story comes from the other versions of him, where in the earliest scene on the timeline, in one of the first 2188 flashbacks that we see the quote-unquote future version of him, and we do get a lot of this mystery being set up of like, what is this distant future that we're seeing? That we obviously find out the truth later on. We do also learn that the real identity of BJ is the AI version of the previous version of Miura, which again is another really cool reveal here. And I did like the level of connective tissue here between Miura and Minami's storylines, considering how interconnected those two characters are. Then we have Yuki Takamiya, who I really liked as a character, but I did feel like her story was one of the least important to the overall narrative. We do learn that she is being blackmailed into working for the SIU and is watching over the other protagonists as a part of this. We do also see her relationships with Minami and Amaguchi. Most of her base storyline is doing some investigations with Erika Aiba, this fellow student who follows her around, that we later find out to actually be a version of Tamao Karabe, who is strangely part of the group that the Sentinel users belong in, as being one of the 15 survivors from the past, along with Okino as well. But I find it strange how these two characters aren't playable and don't have their own Sentinels, as that's not really ever explained. Like, I don't know why. Why is it 13 people that we play as and 13 Sentinels? Like, it doesn't make that much sense. Like, it's never really explained within the story. Next up, we have Ninji Ogata, whose base storyline is pretty basic, where he essentially just relives the same memory over and over and over again, and is being held hostage by Okino in order to find out who has the key that activates the kaijus. And through that, we replay again the same section over and over and over again, but gain new information each time. And while this is very simplistic, I actually like this from a conceptual standpoint, as each of the outcomes that arise from this section of the game are actually pretty radically different. But through this, we do see a lot of focus around his relationship with Kisaragi, who, I guess we'll talk about now. And I really like Kisaragi, and her storyline does actually provide a decent amount of revelations, especially considering how early on you can play it. Though we initially get introduced to her in 1985, it turns out she is actually from 2025, and she does end up accidentally traveling back to 2025 along with Ogata and her friend Sawatari, who's probably the most prominent character that doesn't end up affecting the overall narrative, but also probably the most prominent character that is a complete fabrication of this simulation, as pretty much every major character within this game is a version of the 15 survivors from the real life storyline. But again, I did like Kisaragi's storyline here. I did feel like we got a decent amount of revelations, we got a decent amount of interesting set pieces, and I just overall just liked the character, though in the English dub, she is voice acted by the same person that plays Morgana in Persona 5, and I really just can't get Morgana out of my head when listening to her voice acting. Next up, we have Ryoko Shinonome, who is a SIU member tracking down a prisoner named 426, who she initially believes to be Sekigahara, but we later find out that is actually Jiro Izumi. And again, her storyline has a lot of great mystery surrounding it, with her also having lost her memories like Jiro and Sekigahara, but it's through her storyline that we do learn that she is the one responsible for their memory losses. And we do learn more about Ida, particularly that it was her that killed him, despite her seemingly being obsessed with him. And I did feel like this storyline also made it very clear that Ida was connected to Amaguchi due to their strange interactions throughout the storyline. Now, from a gameplay perspective, though, I did find your sections kind of annoying, as you constantly have to take pills to continue on and to do the same few conversations at the beginning of each of her storylines before getting to any differences. So because I did find her sections kind of annoying to actually play. But now for the final character we have in Renya Godo, whose storyline is really strange, where most of it is actually locked until really deep into the game, and you're forced to finish his storyline last due to the unlock conditions, and his storyline mostly just serves as a dump of story revelations over being its own actual coherent narrative in its own right, where a lot of his story revolves around his conversations with the young Chihiro, and through their conversations we do learn that Chihiro actually has the memories of the real-life Morimura, who we find out is the one that actually killed the other Morimura, and we do get a bevy of reveals around what happened in the real world and the true purpose of the simulation. And we do see Godo convince Chihiro to help the group out during the final battle, which we do see in the destruction section of the game way earlier. But here we do see those events from a different perspective, and this leads directly into the final few waves of the destruction mode, as to play those waves, you actually need to complete the resemblance mode first. And with that, we can essentially talk about the ending of the game, which again comprises of the final few waves of the destruction section. And gameplay wise, I will say that the final battle was kind of underwhelming to me. I mean, it really felt like just a massive onslaught of enemies that you had to survive, but it didn't really feel like a conclusive battle for the game. But once we do complete the final fight, the simulation is shut down, allowing the clones of the 15 survivors, those that we have played as throughout the game, to enter the real world, with them having arrived on a new planet that has been terraformed in a way to restart humanity. And that's when we cut to credits, which if we had ended there, I would have found that to be a really underwhelming ending, as it does feel like kind of an abrupt ending for a over 30-hour game. But after this, we do get a pretty lengthy post-credits section where we do go to each of the major characters and conclude their storylines, where we find out that 5 years later, the clones have returned to the simulation, and we learn about the numerous couples that have formed since, and this does lead to a lot of fun dialogue with them talking about how much older they are while still being in their younger simulated bodies. And this leads to some confusion from the characters within the simulation. But we do learn that they plan on using this simulation to transfer the AIs into real life bodies, essentially repopulating the real world, which again was a much more satisfying conclusion for this story here, with again pretty much every character and storyline being wrapped up pretty well. And that's essentially the game. Again, 13 Sentinels is a game that really caught me off guard, and it's a game that tells a narrative on a scale that we rarely see in gaming. I mean, when we have this story that needs an in-game timeline for you to keep track of it, you know it's going to be a pretty complex story told here. I mean, to be honest, probably too complex for its own good, where at points I did feel like it was hard to follow. I mean, a lot of that having to do with obviously its ridiculous length, but also with the different time periods and constantly switching between characters. Like, it did get pretty hard to remember how certain characters and plot points were connected. And again, without that timeline, I don't feel like I would have been able to fully grasp this story. But I do love that this game takes so many risks with the way it tells its story. I mean, while the story itself isn't anything radically new, the story is presented in a way that I've never seen, especially within the video game medium. I mean, while I was able to predict where the story was going throughout points, like the actual plot points themselves, I will give this game a lot of credit for actually surprising me with how we got to those plot points throughout the game. I mean, 13 Sentinels for me was really an experience unlike any other for me within the gaming medium, and obviously to the point where I felt obligated to make a video here. But with that said, those are my thoughts on 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Thank you for watching.